Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grey History. In this fantastic collaboration with Daniele Bolelli of History on Fire, we're going to explore the fascinating life of Thomas Paine, a revolutionary who shaped British, American, and French politics. Paine is one of the most unique and controversial founding fathers. From fame to infamy and a lucky escape from the Terror, there is plenty to unpack in this most unusual of tales. So please enjoy this amazing episode with History on Fire, and you can find History on Fire on all podcast apps. As lovers of French history, I would particularly recommend the series on Joan of Arc. Of course, before we get into it, a quick reminder that I need your help. If you're enjoying Grey History, please consider supporting the show by making a small donation to the podcast. By donating just a cup of coffee, you can help produce history that isn't black and white, all while enjoying hours of bonus content and ad-free listening. There's links in the show notes and on the website, so if you can, please support the revolution today. You can also help the show by recommending it to friends and family, sharing the show on social media, or leaving a review. Anyway, that's enough from me, so let's get into it. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special collaboration episode between Grey History, the French Revolution, and History on Fire. My name is Will Clark, and I'm the host of Grey History, and joining me today is the amazing historian, author, and podcaster, Daniele Bolelli. Daniele, how are you going?
Good, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm going pretty well. I'm looking forward to getting into what we're about to discuss. I mean, obviously, listeners don't know this, but we have been throwing around some ideas about a potential collaboration and what that might look like. And, needless to say, the thematics covered by History on Fire and the events in the French Revolution, we had plenty to choose from. And I'm excited to say that we're going to explore an American revolutionary, a French revolutionary, an English revolutionary, someone who has just a fascinating life story and is incredibly controversial, but for quite unique reasons. And that is a very long way of saying we're going to explore Thomas Paine. And I know that Paine is a historical figure that has captured your imagination and your interest as well. To kick us off, do you want to maybe paint us a picture of Paine's early life before his most famous publication of Common Sense?
Definitely. I'm going to, maybe I'll kick this off just for the fun of it by reading something that I'd written about Thomas Paine a long time ago. It was over a decade ago. This was a little introduction to a short essay I wrote about him. So I'll read this out, but then don't worry, sweet listeners, we're not going to make you listen to stuff that we read. We're going to be chatting again. But this passage seems to capture for me the importance of Paine in how big of a deal he was. Because, many people today may or may not be clear on just how important Thomas Paine was in the history of that period. So this passage goes like this. It says, "The story of his life is richer and weirder than any fiction. Among his close friends were visionary poets such as William Blake, as well as political icons like Benjamin Franklin. Napoleon slept with his books by his pillow and told him that statues of gold should be erected to him in every city in the universe. The admiration, however, was not reciprocated, since Paine was not a fan of Napoleon. Thomas Edison believed him to be one of the most brilliant minds in human history. Some of his writings rank among the greatest bestsellers of the 18th century. He participated in two revolutions, the American and the French, that changed the political face of the modern world. During the American Revolution, George Washington used these writings to inspire his troops to remember what they were fighting for. and even suggested that no other individual had done more for the cause of American independence. John Adams stated that without his pen, Washington's military victories would have been in vain. In France, the revolutionaries invited him to join the National Convention in charge of drafting a new constitution. His unconditional love for freedom, however, made him allergic to revolutionary totalitarianism just as much as he was opposed to monarchic totalitarianism. So Robespierre and his cronies had him arrested and sentenced to death. But the blade of the guillotine missed the date with his neck thanks to a mistake by the jailer in delivering condemned prisoners. Before the mistake was fixed, a future American president, James Monroe, intervened on his behalf and had him rescued. And another president, Thomas Jefferson, personally offered him political asylum. The man we're speaking of is Thomas Paine. So that's basically tells everything we're going to touch on very quickly, but it gives an idea of just how wild and weird his life was. And the thing that's interesting is, today some people know Paine. He's not like he's erased from history, but he's not exactly a household name the way so many of the founding fathers in the United States are remembered and all of that. And so another theme I want to explore that will clear up by the end is why his face is not on Mount Rushmore, why he's not on the dollar bill, why he's not much more of a household name than he currently is. So that's something we'll touch on. A good place to begin is always the beginning. And so we'll start with his life a little bit. Now, he was born in the mid-1730s in England. The formative influences in his life came from a variation of Christianity, specifically Quaker tradition. And Quaker tradition is unusual and unconventional enough in the scheme of mainstream Christianity of the 1700s that in many ways will start explaining the direction that Paine takes in his life. Later on, after doing a whole variety of odd jobs, he ended up meeting Benjamin Franklin in London, and Franklin was impressed enough with him to try to convince him to move across the ocean and visit in what still were the British colony, hoping to become the United States. I'm skipping the part of his early life in England. Considering everything we need to look at, it's the most uneventful one, is quasi-normal. If one does a biographical story on Thomas Paine, sure, you can go into that, but it's not quite as important. But things really kick off across the ocean. He barely makes it because apparently the water supply on board were not exactly the cleanest, and several other passengers died of typhoid fever. By the time he made it, Ben Franklin doctor visiting him, he was more dead than alive. He had to be carried off the ship, took 6 weeks to recover. Once he was clear that he was going to survive, he became a citizen of Pennsylvania. And then one of the things he started doing is he started working on a couple of different magazines. One called the American Magazine, for which he became its editor. And this magazine started blowing up after Paine took it over and began to choose the article, write his own articles, and so on and so forth. And then he became the editor also of something called the Pennsylvania Magazine. One of the characteristics that we already see he was slightly odd for the times, he was an extremely strong abolitionist. He often wrote about his desire to eliminate human slavery across the board, which, in the northern colonies was a little more popular of a concept, definitely was not in the southern ones, but even in the northern, it was not quite as popular as Paine was advocating it. By the time the American Revolution kicks in, where, for frame of reference for people, 1775 is when the break begins, and for all intents and purposes, the process of the American Revolution starts, and the whole thing is not going to be completely done until 1783. At the very beginning of 1776, Paine writes one of the most important pamphlets of the era, which is something called Common Sense. Common Sense became a huge bestseller, There's debate about exactly how much he sold, because some people say, there are these huge numbers, but these are kind of self-reported by Paine and nobody knows. But it's undeniable that it sold a lot of copies at the time. It was probably the most widely read pamphlet of the American Revolution. Incidentally, as a shout out, I should mention that sadly there's Dan Carlin had a quasi-defunct podcast that is Dan Carlin's Common Sense that clearly took its title from
I
Thomas
didn't
Paine.
realize that was the connection. Okay, there you go. Yeah, no, I'm aware of Dan Cohen's work.
He never told me explicitly, but I'm 99% sure that it was based on Thomas Paine. But yeah, beside that, the pamphlet was passed around all over. It's something that they say they read it in taverns. It was discussed among neighbors. And, this is at a time when not everybody's super literate or anything. So for a pamphlet to have that much of an impact is particularly impressive. And mainly, one of the things it did is it really made a case for why the revolution was important, why independence was important. Not just about, because so much, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, a lot of it is about how bad and terrible King George was. That's not what Paine is doing. He's not picking on one particular monarch at one particular time. He's making a case that monarchy in general is a terrible idea. And he's making a case that even wider, aristocracy in general, the concept of aristocracy is flawed. Because while the idea of aristocracy is about the best in a society ruling, the reality is that it rarely is based on quality. It's more based on family connection and things like that. So you end up having power concentrated in the hands of few people, not power concentrated in the hands of the best people. So he really goes all out, essentially writing a manifesto to destroy what's the current foundation of politics at the time, which was all based on aristocratic and monarchic ideals. A rather radical thing to do. Now, he wasn't the first to argue things like that, but he was great at writing in a language that most people understood. Whereas, if somebody read a philosophical treatise on this topic, 99% of the people would have no idea what the guy is talking about because they wrote in this very ivory tower type of language. Paine wrote in a language that was very accessible. I mean, even today, you can still read him and understand him. He's, of course, much more difficult than he was back then, but it's completely understandable.
Absolutely. Well, I think, as you said before, there's a significant portion of the country or of the colonies that are illiterate. And Paine is deliberately crafting this as something that is not only to be read, but to be read aloud and to be read to others. And if you look at the way he constructs his arguments, it's not this long rhymes or fluffy language. It's very direct, it's blunt, it's to the point, very accessible. And that is in part why it was so successful. And as you say, it's not this ivory tower, theoretical, metaphysical discussion. Paine famously didn't really like quotes. He's not someone to sit there and quote Montesquieu over and over and over. I would recommend to listeners, actually, because it is all in the public domain, listen to Common Sense or read Common Sense. You will see why this was such a groundbreaking document at the time.
Absolutely. And he writes in a very emotional style. He writes in a way that's designed to get an emotional reaction from his readers. So again, it's something that's designed to steer passion and not purely appeal to some subtle rational argument. And in general, he was fairly radical. I mean, even by the standards of American revolutionary, like John Adams, for example, was a bit suspicious of him because he felt that Paine was promoting a type of very radical concept of democracy. And by radical, I mean, it makes us laugh today, but back then it was very radical, something that would make John Adams rip the hair from his head. But the notion that men who did not own property should still be allowed to vote and hold office was something completely wild. Like, you need to be a gentleman. You need to have a certain amount of money and property in order to vote or let alone run for office. Paine was like, no, not at all. That's not what it's about. And again, today, normal for us, but back then was not normal at all.
Also, Paine fundamentally he wasn't necessarily on board with creating a federalist country where you have all these states with their own unique legislatures. A lot of them would have a second chamber, the Senate, the power in the executive that eventually gets formed. Obviously, you have the Confederation period and the Constitution isn't for a while yet. But some of these ideas about what would replace British rule are already being discussed. And as you said, Adams in particular, well, the feeling's mutual. The two of them definitely disagreed on a lot about what would replace British rule in the colonies.
Absolutely. Because again, it's one thing to be all in agreement about let's get rid of British rule. It's a whole other thing to figure out what system should replace. Now, in regards to that, there's a bit of debate about how much of a role he played in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence. You have some scholars actually suggesting that he may have written some parts of it, others that are not as radical in that regard. They say, no, it was still Jefferson who wrote them, but Jefferson was heavily influenced by Thomas Paine. So while it may have not been Thomas Paine's hand, Thomas Paine ideas were very much in Jefferson's mind when he wrote it. So, from a very direct participation of Paine into this to an indirect one, but nonetheless, it's undeniable that he played a big role in the Declaration of Independence itself. He wrote also, beside Common Sense, he wrote other popular pamphlets, like one was called The American Crisis. And there are some quotes that then have gone down in history, like the opening quote of The American Crisis goes like, "These are the times that try men's souls." And, these are one of those lines that's quoted over and over again. During the Revolutionary War, he served as an assistant to an important general named Nathaniel Greene. So he played also somewhat of a direct role. But this is where I'm going to pass the ball back to you, because it's at this time as the revolution in the US is in full swing and will eventually succeed, that he went on a mission to France to try to raise money for the revolution. It's also later on, after the end of the American Revolution, where he visits back in London and he becomes kind of involved in the revolution that would start. I mean, the French Revolution would not start until 2 years later, but the ramblings are there. And so, now we are going to transition from his role in the American Revolution to his role in the French Revolution. So I will pass the ball to you. The discussion about his rivalry with conservative intellectual Edmund Burke and all of that, that's all yours.
Perfect. Well, I'm glad that you mentioned Edmund Burke because, Paine, he's a fascinating individual, but in the context of the French Revolution, you can't not discuss Edmund Burke. He's just so important to Paine's trajectory at this time. So as you say, he comes back from the independent United States of America. He's on private business in England primarily. And while he's back in England, a couple of years later, the French Revolution breaks out in 1789. And then in 1790, there is not a dramatic event, but a dramatic publishing. And this is where Edmund Burke comes in. So Burke was an Anglo-Irish statesman. He had been a member of Parliament for a couple of decades at this point in time. He's about 60 years old. And despite his later fame for his conservatism and being considered as one of the founding fathers of political conservatism today, originally Burke had actually had some quite radical views. He was notable for his early sympathies to the American revolutionaries, his support for Catholic emancipation, and given these stances and given his association with the Whigs, so the more constitutionalist grouping in Parliament, Burke's actions in November 1790 were all the more astonishing. And what Burke did was he released a political pamphlet titled Reflections on the Revolution in France. And the consequences of this document are still impacting our lives today. It was a blistering assault on the French Revolution, and Burke proceeded to pretty much systematically rebuke every aspect of the endeavour across the Channel. He denounced the French deputies, he disparaged their policies, but perhaps most importantly, he decried the very principles which were underpinning the revolutionary reforms in France. And in particular, he savaged the concept of natural rights. And to cover what Burke was condemning would take a podcast in itself. But in short, what the French were up to was the complete eradication of the old regime. So this is the initial years of the revolution. We're not yet in the era of the French Republic. But what we're seeing is more than just a replacement of the absolute monarchy with a constitutional monarchy. From very early on, we see the French revolutionaries commence a project that is essentially remaking every aspect of society. Not only would the king have his powers significantly reduced, not only would the aristocracy be abolished outright, the Catholic Church would be completely revolutionized. Its lands were nationalized, its priests became employees of the state, its administrative systems were overhauled, and then on top of that, you've got a whole host of political, social, and economic reforms as well. And so, as the French were doing this, they were drafting their new constitution. And this is what Burke really took issue with, because the revolutionaries were drafting their constitution using the principles of natural rights. And it's these rights which were central to Burke's repudiation. And it's also these rights which are central to Thomas Paine's second masterpiece after Common Sense, which was titled Rights of Man. So maybe to quickly explain what natural rights were, because they are pretty critical to understanding both Burke's criticisms and Paine's second work. Back in the 18th century, many philosophers championed the idea that there were these things called natural rights. And they asserted that natural law and natural rights were a superior way in which to establish a society and to administer a government. And this is an alternative to, say, a divine right to rule, which had been the norm in Europe at the time. And, some said that these natural rights were granted by God or a higher power, while for others, they were kind of self-evident and they could be deduced by philosophy. But whatever the case, there was this idea that these natural rights were both universal and inalienable. The universality meant that they applied to everyone around the world. And then because they were universal and they derived from nature, they were inalienable. And what this meant is that an individual could not be alienated from their universal rights. A person was always entitled to their natural rights by the laws of nature. No legitimate society could deprive them of these rights. And the French were using these rights to build their new society. They declared that men were born free and equal in rights. They declared that the goal of any political association was the conservation of these rights. And then, at least initially, funnily enough, these natural rights change over time. But at least initially, in the constitutional monarchical era, these rights are liberty, property, safety, and resistance against oppression. And these natural rights sort of acted as a North Star for the French revolutionaries. And once they had done that, they kind of had no choice but to overturn everything else. How can an aristocracy exist if all men are born equal in rights? How can an aristocracy perpetuate when it fails to enhance the public interest? I mean, these are the kind of ideas that, as you said earlier, Thomas Paine was picking up in Common Sense more than a decade before. To expand that further, also, if you look at the king, why should the king be empowered to prevent the will of the people through a veto, for example, when sovereignty resides in the whole nation? And so these were just some of the ways that the kind of principles of the future or the age of revolutions was clashing with the frameworks of the past.
I guess I'd love to ask you something. You mentioned how Burke was somewhat sympathetic to the American Revolution, but he's going really harsh against the French Revolution. On the surface, it sounds like the American and French Revolution, never mind how they develop later, but on the surface, in terms of ideals, it sounds very much like they are championing many of the same ideas. I mean, it's like the Declaration of Independence begin with this idea of these inalienable rights that everybody has, liberty, happiness, all that stuff. So why was Burke okay with this in the American case, but he was so opposed to the French one?
Yeah, so Burke's initial sympathies with the revolution were in some ways a bit more based on policy and specific complaints around the way that the British were treating the Americans. If you then expand what you were saying further about on the surface, these revolutions look like they are championing very similar principles. And I agree that on the surface, that's definitely the case. But underneath that, what the Americans largely do is, to a significant extent, they are importing the British model. And they are importing many of the kind of what they would term the traditional rights or the inherited rights of Englishmen. And this is where the rubber kind of hits the road and why Burke can be supportive of one and criticize the other. Burke looks at these ideas of natural rights and he's horrified by them. For him, grounding a society on natural rights was madness. It was foolish. It was dangerous. It would, in fact, in reference to the French, he explicitly warned of terror and military dictatorship, which, given where the French Revolution goes, he's right on the money. And Burke's alternative, and this ties into where the Americans had not made the same error, Burke's alternative, his big idea, was that successful societies should be built upon what he called inherited rights. And these rights, these inherited rights, were liberties that were passed down from one generation to the next. So they were not universal, but they were unique to specific societies, and they were inherited from one's forebears. So, in the British context, this meant things like the existence of regular parliaments, that no laws and taxation could occur or that would only be legal when approved by a parliament. And these kind of ideas, which the American revolutionaries pick up on as well to an extent, are the so called ancient rights of Englishmen. And this is what Burke is talking about by inherited rights. And so Burke's argument is that every society should set up its own unique, or should be built upon its own unique set of inherited rights, which have developed organically over time, and that Burke essentially argues that this was a preferable way to govern a society rather than, say, some abstract or metaphysical principles that were being embraced by the French. So to come back to your question, the Americans, to a significant extent, look at the traditions, the customs, the institutions of Great Britain, and they obviously make some significant changes. It's not a monarchy, but there are aspects of it that are quite similar. And if you then put this from a relative perspective, not from what the Americans create to the British, but what the Americans create to the French, Burke essentially would argue that the French are overturning every aspect of their previous social contract. They're attacking the monarchy, the aristocracy, the church. They're rejecting the wisdom of their ancestors. Whereas the Americans, they did look at some aspects of the British system, such as the separation of powers and a two-chamber legislature, and they did incorporate what had worked in the past. I suppose their inherited wisdom, if you like. Does that make sense?
Sure. I mean, it's interesting because it's on the surface, it's so close what they advocate. But also, you're right, also to point out that they end up in different places, and they end up in different places for reasons, not just because of accidents of history. So it's like, probably is like the degree. I mean, they are both very radical concepts for the times that they embraced, but some went even a little further. So yeah, that makes sense.
And I think you see the French going their own way even more so once they come around to creating their own republican constitution. Their constitution of 1793 looks nothing like the American Constitution. And at that point in time, actually, to be a proponent of federalism was worthy of a death sentence in France. It is so different, the trajectory that they're on. Before we move on to Paine, just quickly, what Burke was arguing for, which was this kind of idea of being deferential to ancient customs, inherited wisdom, gradual reforms, a deference to what's worked in the past, that there is the underpinning of political conservatism, in a nutshell. And that is part of the reason why Burke is considered to be one of, if not the founding father of conservatism today. So when I say Burke's reflections on the French Revolution are relevant to us today in every way, more so than we think, that's why Burke is still in our lives so much, as is Thomas Paine. So Paine, he's back in England at this point in time, and inevitably he hears about Burke's work. And he can't not hear about it. I mean, Burke's Reflections is a bestseller. It's translated into languages across Europe. Even the French king, Louis XVI, reads Burke's Reflections. Thomas Jefferson reads it, who's horrified. But it's Paine that takes it upon himself to reply. And this is where his work, Rights of Man, comes from. And if Burke let loose on the French Revolution, well, Paine lets loose on Edmund Burke. And he not only attacks Burke, but then more broadly, he attacks the British monarchy and the parliamentary system that Great Britain had at that time. And then he also makes the case for social rights and a real kind of different society to what had been established at that point in time. And so that's why The Rights of Man was such a groundbreaking work. To explore that a little bit more, as it relates to Burke, Paine offered an impassioned defense of the French Revolution and a complete rebuke of Burke's criticisms. He argued that societies should be founded on natural rights. Burke's idea that a social contract should be built on inherited rights, according to Paine, was nuts. For Paine, the idea that a society should be this kind of random mix and match organic framework that was passed down from one generation to the next was madness. And moreover, he disputed that Burke's inherited rights even existed. For Paine, rights must be universal and they must be inalienable. They must derive from nature, because if they didn't derive from the laws of nature, then as far as Paine was concerned, they weren't really rights. And this meant that Burke was wrong and that the British had been led astray. English monarchs considered themselves the sovereign power, and they dispensed grants and concessions as they saw fit. So in Burke's so-called inherited rights, what they really were, according to Paine, was just forms of privileges that had been granted by monarchs. So, the House of Commons did not originate as a matter of right. It was a concession from the Crown. And so, as far as Paine was concerned, Burke had essentially just mislabeled privileges, grants, licenses, etc. And all of these had their origins in treaties or concessions. And so for Paine, natural rights that derived from the laws of nature and applied to all societies, irrelevant of, creed or culture and the like, that was the only rational basis to fabricate a society. And that was essentially a repudiation of Burke's work. But then, as I said, he goes on to attack the British system and then argue for a more expansive social rights as well.
That makes perfect sense. And of course, Paine was very well received in England and everybody loved him. No, not quite, right? All sort of bad things start happening for him at that point, right?
Absolutely. That second part of what Paine argues, it's not just a rebuttal of Burke. Paine is an international revolutionary, and he uses the rights of man to lay out a revolutionary agenda. It's interesting because Burke essentially argues that only gradual changes should be made to the British Constitution. And Paine actually argues that there is no British Constitution. Paine argues that because there's no written constitution, there's no constitution at all. And then he goes one step further and says that actually what the British should do is create a constitutional convention in the same way that the Americans had done and create a written constitution. And understandably, from the perspective of the British elite, Paine's demands were troubling. And they were even more troubling when you look at the rest of his book. And Paine is denouncing the English nobility and advocating for its abolition. He's denouncing the distinction between kings and subjects. He's championing the republican model, and he's demanding significant reforms to Parliament. And as you alluded to, this ultimately results in action against him by the authorities, and Paine is forced to flee France in 1792. Which is funny because even more so than Burke, Paine's work is selling like hotcakes at this point. We get figures that are disputed, but perhaps 300,000 copies are sold in the first 2 years once you combine part 1 and part 2. So that's maybe not as popular as common sense given the timeframes and the like, and certainly from a relative perspective if you think about the populations involved, but it's a significant bestseller. And the British authorities aren't too happy about this, and so Paine has to flee the country, and he is tried in absentia for sedition, essentially, and then multiple people are prosecuted in connection to helping publish Paine's work. And, incidentally, before we pick up on Paine in France, what we actually see in Great Britain, we associate Great Britain with being this long-running democracy, but actually democracy as we think of it today, in the same way that you were discussing before about what a democratic young America would look like in terms of voting rights and the like, Great Britain looked very different in the late 18th century. And what we see in the final decade of the 18th century is a real crackdown on civil liberties that effectively stamp out the reformist movement that sees Paine as one of their champions. There are attempts to hold constitutional conventions, they're cracked down, and then eventually the next year you get France and England going to war in 1793, and that legally enables a key justification for cracking down on these movements. But it is interesting to see just the impact of Paine's work and how that plays out in Britain, because understandably, to back up a little bit, Burke's work, Reflections on the Revolution in France, that's a very specific title. It's not Reflections on the French Revolution. It's Reflections on the Revolution in France because Burke anticipates that there might be a revolution in Poland, in Spain, in Britain, and he is trying essentially to preempt that and prevent it. But that's what the British authorities are worried about, and that's why they are willing to pursue Paine for these ideas which they view as dangerous to society.
Absolutely, and that's where Paine has become a hero in the United States, has become somewhat of a villain or anti-hero, depending on the perspective of the people in England. Now has to flee England, and now we make it to country number 3, where he's going to play a big role, which is going to be France. And on the surface, it's pretty crazy, the fact that he doesn't even speak French, and he's elected to the National Convention as, I forget if he was the only foreigner or one of the very few foreigners to do so. He gets, the whole thing, and I guess this is where your expertise on the period comes in, because what follows when he arrives in France is a mess, and it would be very easy to get lost. It would be very easy to do a multi-part series and long episodes and all that, because it's a complicated, you have to give background about who are some of the different political players in France, how Paine fits into this, why some love him and some hate him, how does he end up in jail, We are going to do the highlight version, so if you want to take it from there.
Perfect. Well, we'll see how we go. I suppose just as quick background, by late 1792, as you mentioned, France has what it calls a national convention. We are in the Republican era by this point in time. So we have the constitutional monarchy phase for about 3 years. And now, after the violent overthrow of the monarchy, we have this national convention. And it gets its name, surprise, surprise, in part from the American Constitutional Convention. And this body will be the government of France during the Terror and during much of the War of the First Coalition. And its primary task, a task which it's often distracted from, is to create France's Republican Constitution. And as you mentioned, Paine is one of the foreigners. There's a handful, I think there's at least 2, I'm not sure if there's a third, of foreigners that are elected to this body. And as you mentioned, he doesn't speak a word of French. And he doesn't even understand it. It's not like someone can speak to him in French and he can kind of follow along and then he can kind of mumble back. He's got nothing. And so you get these quite comical scenes where he speaks through a translator at the National Convention, and he just kind of stands there with a bit of a blank face, and he doesn't really know, if his words are really being conveyed as he means. But having been elected to the convention, he does his best to try to promote the ideas that he has promoted in Common Sense and more recently in Rights of Man, including some of the social ideas that he's promoted around things like a widespread education and poor relief and funding these measures by significant taxation on the wealthy. Unfortunately, this does not go to plan. Paine becomes friendly with the Girondist faction of the convention. These are the more moderate, and I use that word loosely, deputies of the convention. From the perspective of any royalist, they're not moderate. But comparatively, compared to the Jacobins and the other participants of the convention, they are. The Girondins are the first faction to be purged and ultimately executed in the French Revolution. I mean, this is a revolution that's famous for devouring its own creators. Many of the major figures will end up dead, and the Girondins are, the first on the chopping block. Given Paine's association with the Girondins, he creates a target on his back, as did his prior advocacy for sparing the life of King Louis XVI. That's one of the first major things the convention has to handle is what are they going to do with the king? And they eventually put him on trial and they eventually execute him. But a significant minority, Paine included, argued for a lesser sentence like exile or life imprisonment, and Paine's advocacy against the death penalty is also now haunting him less than a year later. On top of this, Paine was English, and by late 1793, the Girondins have been purged, and also the war with England has really ratcheted up. And so Paine is arrested for being English at the end of 1793. And as you alluded to in your intro, he's very lucky to have survived. The French didn't move to execute him immediately. Theoretically, he had some value to the Americans. He was meant to be, an American hero. And the French were cautious of angering one of the few nations that was neutral at this point in time, or even debatably a French ally in some ways. But eventually, the guillotine comes for us all, or at least it does if you're a French revolutionary. And as you say, the exact circumstances of his survival are a little contested, but the story goes that if you're a condemned prisoner, the kind of clerk would walk around the prison and they would put a cross mark with a piece of chalk on your door, and that was essentially a sign that you would be collected tomorrow. Apparently, Paine's door was open at the time that the clerk went around and made this mark, and so the next day when Paine's door was closed, the mark wasn't visible to the jailer. That's the story that we get. I mean, as you can imagine with a story like that, there's a few ways in what might have actually happened. We don't know. It's more than possible that the clerk was drunk. For those people that are wondering, wasn't it obvious that this door was open and then it would be closed? But yeah, that's how Paine survives, and he does actually return to the convention, and he makes at least one more speech. He's pretty keen to get out of France at that point, subject to he has quite poor health and the like at that point in time.
Absolutely. So that leads us to him getting out of France. And I guess we should mention, there was a lot of pressure on, the reason why he's released is because the American ambassador at the time was James Monroe, who will later become president of the United States. And he really makes a case for Paine as a US citizen, as to be released and all that.
Sorry, just to pick up on Monroe's intervention, Monroe's behavior is very stark contrast to the person he replaced in Paris, which was Governor Morris. And Paine almost dies. And understandably, he's angry and he wants to know why the Americans didn't bail him out. And eventually, he takes his anger out on Washington. He holds Washington responsible. He writes multiple letters to Washington. Famously, there's the public letter in 1796, which is just an all-out assault on him. But Governor Morris, who's definitely sympathetic with the British and is not a big fan of the French Revolution, many scholars argue that he essentially cuts Paine adrift. He kind of makes out to the Americans that he's doing what he can for Paine and that they've claimed him as an American citizen. But to the French, he's kind of going, actually, Paine's English. There's a lot of dispute there. And I suppose it's interesting, the Americans at this point, another American revolutionary hero, the Marquis de Lafayette, he's in an Austrian prison at this point in time, but his family, his wife and her family, are in a French prison during the Terror. And the American officials in Paris are making it very clear to the French authorities that if the wife of Lafayette was executed, the American public might be so angry that the Americans abandon neutrality and join the war against France. And so it's a really interesting comparison as to how Paine was being treated prior to Monroe's arrival and how they were looking after Lafayette's wife. Unfortunately, Lafayette's broader family, many of them had their lives claimed, but his wife did survive the Terror. It's an interesting comparison between those two individuals that are both connected to the American Revolution in very different ways.
Yeah, and Paine is, when Paine is mad, you don't have to guess it. His writing is very explicit, very. At one point, he had this line toward Washington. Washington had been a huge fan of Thomas Paine in the past, had used his writings for his troops, had done this. And Paine in this letter says, the world will be puzzled to decide whether you're an apostate or an impostor, whether, and this is my favorite part, whether you have abandoned good principles or whether you ever had any. It is like, damn, that's a little intense.
Yeah, it's absolutely savage. And it just goes after every aspect of Washington. It goes after his military performance, his administration, his personal principles. Again, historians aren't quite sure whether Paine is kind of blaming Washington erroneously and that Morris should get more of the blame. But certainly, I think Paine does have a case when he says, Washington knew of his imprisonment and should have proactively been trying to help. And so I do think that Paine is, maybe a public letter isn't the right way to go about it, but I do think he has some justification to be a little mad.
And, as we'll see now as we discuss another important work by Paine, he clearly didn't care to be popular, which is funny for a guy who ends up being so popular for his ideas, because, in many ways he could have built on his success from common sense to the rights of man to all of that. And instead, what he wrote at the time, actually, when he was being arrested, while he was in France, and then adds another part later on, he writes a book that, when I was hinting at why somebody whose face should be on the dollar bill, why is it now instead lesser known? There's a very clear reason, and it's this book that he writes at this time called The Age of Reason. The Age of Reason is an all-out attack on organized religion. And it's interesting because he embraced the kind of ideas that today would often be embraced by people who are more of an atheist persuasion. Paine, interestingly enough, and this should be said before we even look at all the content of The Age of Reason, Paine was not an atheist at all. In a weird kind of way, he says, precisely because I believe in God, I have to condemn all these horrible fictions made up by human beings about God. And he starts tearing up, particularly, of course, the traditions he's familiar with, namely Christianity, also Judaism, and indirectly Islam. I guess it's not just a coincidence that he cracks down on Western traditions, of course, because they're the ones he's most familiar with, but also because the main part of his argument in The Age of Reason is that he has a strong feelings regarding the idea of revealed religion. And what I mean by that is the notion that God speaks to human beings, and then human beings carry this message and codify it into a religion. Because he says, revelation, if it does exist, is personal. Is God talks to you. You have had that experience. You can derive something from that. But once it goes from the persons who supposedly receive the message to everybody else, that's not revelation anymore, that's hearsay. That's gossip. That's like playing telephone for 20 generations and trying to come up with the original. There's too much room for things to go wrong, either because people flat out lie, because there's power in pretending to be God's mouthpiece, or because people are crazy and they're making it up, or because people, they actually go on something real, but inevitably through their own perceptions, the message gets twisted. But he basically said the whole notion of a revealed religion is standing on shaky feet and should not be trusted. In a famous passage in The Age of Reason, he spells it out pretty clearly and heavily when he says, I do not believe in the creed professed by the Jewish church, by the Roman church, by the Greek church, by the Turkish church, by the Protestant church, or by any church that I know of. My own mind is my own church. All national institutions of churches, whether Jewish, Christian, or Turkish, appear to me no other than human inventions, set up to terrify and enslave mankind, and to monopolize power and profit. Wow, that's no wonder he's not making friends, because if his ideas were radical in terms of his political ideas, but it was a time when some people hated him and, he gets prosecuted in England, he has all this, but His ideas were very radical, but were just ahead of the times. His ideas in regard religion are much beyond that. They are something that many of the people who loved him in US are horrified when they hear this all-out attack on their cherished traditions.
I think the thing is, as you say, he is attacking every single aspect of kind of institutionalized religions. Holy texts, prophecies, prophets, miracles, the mystery of God, as it relates to Christianity, which is obviously the main game in the context of revolutions in his standing in France and England and America. He's got some nice things to say about Jesus Christ, specifically as in like the individual, but around his conception and death, he's not having any of it. It's interesting because what he says, like if you go listen to his work, and for those interested, you can just listen to audiobooks on The Age of Reason because it's all public domain. It's a complete assault on the Christian faith, realistically. And it's the kind of assault that even if you did today, you would receive significant pushback for. The kind of thing like Voltaire and a few others, like they kind of jest or they poke fun at Christianity, where Paine is coming in like guns blazing. And not necessarily in a way that others hadn't done so before. I mean, Paine's work are rarely kind of original, but just like common sense, where he differentiates himself is he's able to distill these ideas and put them down into a really accessible, short, blunt format. And if someone had done that today, it'd be controversial. And then we've got to put ourselves back into the late 18th century, early 19th century. It sets everything on fire. And as you said, his political ideas, this creates a lot of issues for those that support him politically, because there are reformists that are willing to support Paine to the hilt on his ideas that are in rights of man. But this, The Age of Reason, has gone too far. And so it splinters that reformist movement in Great Britain in particular, but elsewhere. And in conjunction with his attacks on Washington, you can see why this makes him so unpopular. One last thing, though, is, as you said at the start, a lot of people think Paine's an atheist. He's definitely not an atheist. He stresses that so much in the book. And actually, because he's been in the French Revolution, he has seen the de-Christianization campaigns that are happening there firsthand. He has seen the atheism that is being promoted by some revolutionaries. And in some ways, the Age of Reason, not exclusively so, but in some ways, it is a response and a rebuke of the atheism that he is seeing firsthand in the French Revolution. And so it's interesting that he is kind of remembered as an atheist quite often, when actually it's not the case at all.
Yeah, that's a complete misunderstanding of where he's coming from with this, because people feel like he's criticizing organized religion, hence he must be an atheist. It's not the case. And where he comes from in more of a deist perspective, which was tradition at the time that, I mean, if we were to argue, what were some of the ideas that he supported religiously, he believed that creation, as in the natural world, is something too magical, too mysterious, too perfect to have happened by accidents. He believed that there's a creator behind it. And he believes that if you want to learn, because he's essentially taking away the whole idea of books written supposedly from an inspiration from God. He said that's all crap, because that's all stuff that human beings have made up, whether from a real initial revelation or from a fake one, but at the end we get more from the writer than we get from the God that inspired it. So he say, out with all that stuff. How can you still be religious if you get rid of all that? He say, well, because real religion lays in nature. Nature is unaffected by human beings to some degree at least. And so if you want to learn about the creator, you look at the creation, and the creation is nature. That's the uncorrupted scripture of God, according to Paine. Whereas books are made up by human beings. So, he's making a case for, no, I'm not just destroying something, I'm explaining why. And also, he goes hard on, he makes the case that precisely because I believe in a benevolent creator, I find that all these stories attributed to God with all sort of genocide and massacres and people getting squashed and heaven and hell and all of that. they speak of a level of cruelty that he finds incompatible with a benevolent God. And so he's arguing these are human perversions. These have nothing to do with the character of a benevolent creator. He goes super hard, but he does make a very strong case for his belief in a God. He's not arguing in any way, shape, or form along atheist ideas, even though today much of Paine's argument would be embraced by people who are more hardcore atheist or at best agnostic, not so much by people who are members of any major religion. So it's interesting how that works out. But yeah, his fame becomes that of a evil atheist who's against everything that's good about the religious life that people embraced back then and to some degree very much still now. And it's funny because even when they give him chances to sort of revise his take a little bit, like the Age of Reason is written in multiple parts, like primarily two. There's a third minor thing, but like primarily two. And at the end of the first, after the first part was published, some people are saying, "No, you're talking all this crap about the Bible because you didn't have a Bible with you when you were writing because you were in the middle of getting arrested, this and that." And the very beginning of part two, Paine says, "You're right, I did not have a Bible with me. And now that I do have a Bible with me, I'm going through it, and it's so much worse than I remember it." And then he doubles down and goes, whereas in the first part, he lays out the theoretical principles, why he's opposed to revelation and all of this. The second part is almost like a trial lawyer bringing up pieces of evidence. And so he's doing literary criticism of the Bible, of things that either finds the Bible directly contradicting each other from one passage to the next, or passages that he finds cruel and horrible and not compatible with the idea of a good God. Or, he goes down the list of this stuff and just hammers even harder. Not surprisingly, these did not get received in a great way. He lost almost all of the support he had accumulated in his life. By the time he dies, there are half a dozen people following his casket. Based on where he started, you would expect is like a state funeral with tens of thousands attending and all of that. This thing, the Age of Reason, really flips the switch in terms of his popularity in a radical way. And most people who had supported him abandon him. And the funny thing is that Paine just does not care to some degree. He wrote the Age of Reason not to make friends, not to be popular, but to really argue for something he strongly felt. And, in a way, it's paradoxical because he had made these radical attacks on political institutions of the day, and he became a hero for it. He makes the same exact line of thinking, he applies it to a religious institution, and he becomes a villain. So it's funny how, the world was ready to make a shift when it came to the political side, definitely not ready for Paine's ideas when it comes to the religious aspect. But to Paine, they are one and the same. The same principles apply in the sense that it's still about human freedom, and he finds that both of those were obstacles to human freedom, both the political and religious institutions of the day. So if nothing else, you got to hand it to him for being consistent, for not writing just to sell copies or get a pat on the back. He definitely goes hard and pays a price for it.
Yeah, absolutely. For Paine, it's not about selling copies. He dies not rich, to say the least. He waves away a lot of the revenues that he could have got from Common Sense, or donates the proceeds as well. He's a bit of a quarrelsome character in many ways, and he's going to tell you what he thinks. And it just so happens that at the start of his life, at the beginning of his career, I should say, what he is articulating is respected and almost, has quite a receptive audience by the people that he is associating with, particularly if you think about Common Sense. As you say, that was a critique of the political world, and as he moved over into the institutional religious side of things, that audience was not receptive, either because of genuine Christian belief, or there were some individuals that felt that even, amongst some of the elites in these societies at the time, they wouldn't necessarily consider themselves staunchly Christian. I mean, as I said before, Paine's ideas are largely a rehash of ideas that have been around for quite some time. But there is a value, or some individuals associate a value in kind of the religion kind of keeping society together and ordered and, having a functioning and healthy society. And so they're concerned about Paine's attacks, not because it personally offends their religious sensibilities, but because they're worried about the political and societal ramifications. And so, as you say, he dies kind of poor and friendless, I suppose, in a nutshell. And but as you say, he was the one that was consistent throughout his life. So it's a fascinating life story for someone who came from very humble backgrounds and was involved in revolutionary or reformist movements in the three of the major countries of the day.
Absolutely. It's, so often in history we focus on the political leaders, often tied to warfare and all of that. This is interesting because essentially Paine's life is the life of an intellectual, of a guy whose main weapon was his pen and is just all about ideas. But the impact he had and success and hatred he attracted is quite impressive considering what his life was like. Fascinating story for sure, and I'm glad we got to do this scene of seeing it from the American perspective in France, in England. It's really an international story.
Absolutely. Well, to my knowledge, and I'm happy for someone to write in and suggest to me an alternative name, but I can't think of anyone that touches the three nations so much. Obviously, there are individuals, Lafayette, that touch two in terms of France and the US in particular, but in getting England in the mix, I can't think of anyone else. If any listener can, by all means, send me a nominee. Daniele, before we wrap up, do you want to maybe give a quick explanation for the benefit of my listeners as to what you're doing over at History on Fire?
Sure, of course. I started History on Fire back in 2015. I've been releasing episode usually at least once a month. It's essentially a long-form history. I take one topic, whatever hits my fancy at the moment. I research like crazy and then I craft episodes. It can either be a single episode or a series, whether in 2, 3, 4. I think the maximum I've done was 5 episodes on the same topic. And then when I wrap up a story, I move on to the next one. And, the only common thread from one series to the next is that they are epic, larger-than-life stories. As far as time frame or geography, they are all over the place. They range all over the world. They range from 5,000 years ago to 50 years ago. So as far as topics go, is very, very, very open-ended. But, I essentially just do a deep dive on a particular topic, wrap up that series, and then move on to the next one.
Perfect.
Sweet. Well, thank you so much for this. This was fun.
No, I've had an absolute blast, and I look forward to seeing. I know that you hinted that you might do a deep dive into Thomas Paine, the full biography at some point in time in the future. So I look forward to getting the multi-part epic adventure at a future point in time. Thank you for listening to this fantastic collaboration episode with History on Fire. You can find History on Fire on all podcast apps, covering a range of topics from history across the world. But if you can't wait for more grey history, then why not support the show by becoming a member of the community? With hours of bonus content, ad-free listening, and a range of other perks, there's plenty to enjoy while supporting the ongoing creation of the show. There's links in the show notes and on the website, and I look forward to welcoming you personally. As always, thank you for listening, stay safe, and have a great day.